In this episode, renowned Czech translator Alex Zucker spoke about his translated work, the novel Life After Kafka. The novel was originally written in Czech. Alex spoke about the book, writer Magdalena, and about bringing the voice of characters into the English translation. Currently, he is on a book tour with the author in the USA. There is a link provided in the show notes giving the details of the book tour. Alex Zucker is an award-winning and an experienced translator of Czech literature into English. He has translated works by acclaimed Czech authors such as Jáchym Topol and Petra Hůlová. Now, the book that we are going to talk about that you translated recently, Life After Kafka, is by Magdalena, and interestingly, it is about life of Felice Bauer after Kafka left the world, right after Kafka's death, and she's one among three women, I guess, in Kafka's life, and she was betrothed to Kafka a couple of times and didn't marry him finally. So, can you give us more details about the novel Life After Kafka?
I think it can be, in one way it's very simple. It's an imagining of Felice Bauer's life after Kafka. Felice Bauer, who, as you mentioned, was engaged or betrothed to Kafka twice, but they did not marry. Kafka, I would say, basically chickened out, which is par for the course for him. I would say one of the reasons that I was excited to do the book was on the opening page of the novel. There's an imagined letter from Felice Bauer's son, who in the novel is called Jáchym, although in real life his name was Henry or Heinrich. And it's a letter from Felice Bauer's son to Elias Canetti, who wrote a book about Kafka's letters to Felice, which were published in 1967. And Letters to Felice, Kafka's Other Trial, and that came out in the 70s. So Felice Bauer's son writes to Elias Canetti, having read his book, and says, whether he was a great writer, I honestly cannot judge. What I know beyond a doubt is that he was a neurotic, a masochist, and in regard to his relationships with women, a sadist as well. So I said, this is a great opening for a book, to have somebody calling Kafka neurotic, masochists, and sadists. I just thought that would be attractive to publishers too. At Bellevue Literary Press decided they wanted to do it. They have already published 2 other books by Magdalena. But as far as like how to characterize the book, there have been some really great reviews of the novel that have been published. There are a few I feel that really stand out, and one of them was a review in Asymptote Journal by a man named Philip Nobel, Nobel, I don't know how he pronounces it actually, who I think is Czech-born but has lived all over the world and is the founder of Global Voices magazine. And he describes this novel as a collage. He says it's an intricate labyrinth of letters, diaries, interviews, fictions, and the author's own descriptions of working on the book, all blurring the boundary between fact and imagination. And I think that is an excellent summary of the book, or not a summary of the book, but characterization of the book. I think it's been clear to me, let's say, that for some people this is very attractive, and for others it's a turnoff. Right? Different people like to read different kinds of literature. This is not a straightforward novel. That is not how Magdalena writes. I also translated one of her previous books, which in English was called The Attempt.
Yeah, I was about to ask you.
Yeah, it was about Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, who were, as you say, early 20th anarchists, early 20th century anarchists, but also the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I was part of. And employed sort of a similar approach and of combining fact and fiction, but also jumping back and forth in time and in place. Um, and again, if I can imagine for some people that that's disorienting or they don't like the jumpiness of it, but other people really enjoy that.
Yeah, it travels across continents and even timelines. I guess it starts in 1920.
Uh, the opening of the book is 1935. Yeah, and then it ends in 2000 in New York, but it goes up to 2020. And again, as in the attempt, the author herself, also Magdalena Platzova, is in the book.
It makes it very interesting, actually. A writer participating in the book as a character.
Yeah, yeah. So although she's not intervening in the lives of the other characters, she's just herself. Yeah, I say this every time I talk about the book, that although for most people, I think the attraction of the book is this other perspective on Kafka and on this woman who's only been known in history and in literature up to now as an ancillary to Kafka. But to me, the most interesting parts of the book, or the most interesting aspect, is the relationships between Felice Bauer and her family, and how those relationships changed and developed as a result of her migration, forced migration, we can say, from Europe to the United States because she was Jewish, and Hitler had come to power in Nazi Germany, and if you were Jewish in Europe, not everybody realized it, and some people realized it but not in time, and some people realized it in time and still didn't have a way to get out. But if you were Jewish and you realized it, and you realized it in time, and you had the way to get out of Europe, then you got out of Europe. And she was fortunate enough to be able to do that along with her husband and her children. So they ended up moving to Los Angeles, in a neighborhood, Pico Boulevard, which was at that time had a lot of East European Jews in it. So that's, I think, a really interesting part of the novel as well.
Now, as far as our current understanding of Kafka is concerned, through biographies or letters, does the novel give any fresh insight into Kafka the person?
So I knew you were going to ask that, and I I'm not sure how to answer. I think it depends, um, how much you believe what Magdalena is writing. I do think that it certainly can offer new insight. I think if you think about Kafka from the point of view of the people that he had relationships with, instead of just him on his own writing, of course, you're going to end up seeing him differently. And for instance, I am not, I mean, I certainly have read my share of Kafka, but it's been a long time. I mostly read Kafka when I was quite a bit younger. I have not read all of the things that have been, there's this whole new Kafka biography that has come out, by Rainer Stock, translated by Shelley Frisch. I haven't read any of that. His diaries by Ross Benjamin that just came out last year. So, for instance, I did not realize before that the trial is Kafka's reaction to, after his, I think it's his second breakup with Felice Bauer, Greta Block, who's a character in the book as well, who was a close friend of Felice Bauer's and then had some kind of relationship with Kafka on her own. It was rumored produced a child, although that probably isn't true, but the novel engages with that as well. Greta Block called a meeting Kafka and herself and Felice Bauer, and I think there may have been somebody else as well. Now, I guess again, this is something that maybe I should know, but I don't because I'm not actually a huge Kafkaologist. In a hotel to talk about what happened, and Kafka felt like he was being put on trial, and that was why he wrote the trial. So if you know things like that, it can very much alter your view, not necessarily of Kafka's writing itself, but the sources of it, the drivers of it, his personal psychology. And those things are interesting if you're really interested in Kafka. And if you aren't, then you don't care. Do you know what I mean? So, where does art come from? Art comes from life. And so that's also one of the themes of this novel, I guess you could say.
Oh, which part of this novel is fact and which part of this novel is fiction?
Yeah, so I will say that is very clear in the sense that Magdalena does have a note at the end of the novel where she says, this book is a work of fiction. Some of the characters bear the names of people who actually lived, while others are based on real people whose names have been changed. There are also characters and events that are completely invented. And then she says, as for the documents and letters cited in my book, this is in my translation, of course, I'm reading, not the Czech, they are all of my invention except for those listed below. So everything in the book is her invention, except there are the quotations from letters to Felice that Kafka wrote, Felice Bauer. There are some letters from the Greta Bloch collection, which mostly concern her internment in institutions and camps in Italy during World War II. There is some correspondence between Magdalena and Anna Pizzuti, who was an Italian woman who did research into Greta Bloch. And then there's a poem by Goethe. So, in that sense, it's very clear what in the book is fact and what is fiction. There are, for instance, parts of the novel which are interviews or meetings between Magdalena, the author, and, let's say, for instance, Felice Bauer's son, Jáchym, Henry alias Jáchym, which I'm sure are based on the, and she did meet with him, but she doesn't specify. I mean, I don't know if what she writes in the novel is what was actually said. I mean, I guess she recorded it. I don't know. But she's not saying this is exactly what he said and this is what I said, because then she would have had to have his permission.
Magdalena is a journalist, interestingly.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the fact that it's based in part on interviews, research. I mean, her idea to write this novel came from the fact, and she's a teacher, right? So the fact that the way this novel came about was that she was in New York teaching at the what is it called, the Gallatin Center at NYU, Gallatin School of Individualized Study, and she was teaching a course on Kafka, and that spurred her interest, and she started trying to track down Felice Bauer's surviving family members. That's how that began. So yes, absolutely. Her book about Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman and the Occupy movement resulted, or was motivated in part by her reporting on Occupy Wall Street for Czech newspapers, because that happened while she was living in New York City.
I read recently this wonderful interview that you had with the Literary Hub, Lit Hub. You talked about that's wonderful actually. The insights that you are given about translation is really, really, really good. So, a couple of things which interested me, what you mentioned in that is that about voice, about giving particular voice to Phyllis in your translation. Right? Could you please elaborate on that voice part of it?
Sure. So this it was actually not an interview, but a short essay I wrote at the request of Lit Hub, or requests of the Bellevue publishers. Actually, they asked if I would write a piece for LitHub to help promote the novel, and I agreed. And I was trying to think about what would be um, both interesting to people about the novel that they wouldn't find in a review. And then also, it's a series. I should make clear that this essay I wrote is for a series. They have a series of essays about literary translation, so it has to be about translation, not just what I think of the book as a translator. And so I had to go back and I kind of scrolled through my translation earlier draft. Where did I have notes? Where did I have questions? And I thought that this was clear to me all along. The challenge of translating characters who lived in a different time and spoke in a different language, how do you bring them into English in a way that is not faithful, but let's say convincing? Is a word. Katie Silver is a translator I learned a lot from over the years, and she always was advocating for translators to try to do away with this idea that a translation needed to be faithful and instead talk about whether or not it was convincing, and which I really liked. And so the challenge is also that but I also am still bound by what Magdalena wrote, so I'm not completely inventing it. And of course, Felice Bauer, well, would have spoken in German normally, but then when she was in the US, she probably was speaking English. She spoke English to her sons, I imagine, but there's no record, or I don't know of any record of her actually speaking, so I don't know what she sounded like. And because we have Kafka's letters to Felice, where he reports about things that she said to him, but was he being faithful? Did he report accurately on what she said? And that was in German, and I only know it from the English, so that's also a translation. And then some of the other characters in the book, it's actually not just Felice Bauer, but there are, quite a few characters in the book. Her son Joachim, or Henry, and he grew up, I mean, in the States essentially after whatever 6 or 8 years old, however old he was when they came to the States. I don't know how he spoke. I mean, probably Magdalena has a recording of that meeting with him when he was in his 90s. I'm sure they were speaking English, but I didn't hear that recording. And anyway, I'm translating it from the Czech she had. I didn't ask her to send me the recording in English, and I don't know if she even has a recording. So I'm inventing a voice for all of these people. So I just have to think about even simple things like whether or not the person uses contractions. Um, do they, basically kind of the distinction between a more literary and more colloquial type of language when they're speaking in dialogue that is out loud, their actual voice through their vocal cords. But then there's also the thoughts in Felice's head. And it wasn't then also Salman Shakin is a character in the novel. So he was a, publisher from, Germany originally, but then moved to Israel, but founded this publishing house in the United States of Schocken Books, famous publisher. And, when he met with Felice Bauer in order to acquire the letters that Kafka had sent to her, I had to do his voice, and I had to create, I imagined him to be quite formal and even a little bit stiff. So I was trying to get that across, and I'm aware that, there are probably other translators that would do it differently, or I might even do it differently if I went back and did it again. I talk about that in the essay too. There are choices that a person makes that you might make differently if you had to go back and do it over again. But that's the joy and the challenge of literary translation. I say a literary text is a work of imagination in the language it was written, so it is impossible to produce a version of it in another language without imagination. So I had to imagine what these people would have sounded like if they had been speaking in English, if they had been thinking in English.
Something very similar to what a fiction writer does.
Yes, the only difference is that I can't completely make it up because I can't just, I'm doing it based on what Magdalena wrote. It's an adaptation. Yeah.
No, certain sentences that you wrote, I'll just paraphrase. You said in the end, it is inevitable that literary translators add themselves to the work they translate. That's a really very, very insightful statement, actually. Because we have interviewed Michelle Woods on different translations of Kafka. Yeah, that was a wonderful conversation we had, and she was talking about how each translator brings his own personality and his own background and understanding of life into translation of the same book, right? How it was, and every translator makes it interesting in some way.
I think there was I mean, it was funny, even writing this essay for LitHub, I talk about a place where the author uses this word mashuga, which is a Czech spelling of mashuga or mashuga, meaning crazy. But there are different ways to say that in English, and some people say mashuga and some people say mashugana. And I used mashugana because that was what I had heard most often, growing up where I live. But
You lived in Prague for some time, right?
I did. But mashugana, I know from, I don't know, people in TV and movies and things like that. But I guess if you grew up in New York City, hearing people, Jews from Eastern Europe, I mean, maybe they did say mashuga, not mashugana. I don't know. So that's a very personal choice.
You mentioned about Phyllis's relationship with her children, and you said it personally resonated with you. Can you talk about it a bit, please?
So the personal connections that I felt to this novel, and in a way to Felice Bauer, but more to the family of Felice Bauer, come from the fact that, unsurprisingly, I also come from a family of immigrants. I mean, most people do in the U.S. Of course, not everybody in the U.S. is an immigrant. There are indigenous people, and there are people who are brought to the United States as slaves. But my father was born in New York City, but his father was from what is now southeast Poland, and his mother was from Vienna. And then my mother was actually born in France, and she came over at the age of 6 in 1941 with her parents, one of her aunts, and her grandmother. When Nazi Germany invaded France, a lot of French people fled to the south, and they fled to the south and then made it out through. They were in Spain and then Portugal and then England and finally came to the United States. But the connection that I felt was, I would say, sort of the complexity of the emotions in a migrant family, and some of the difficulty that people have talking about what happened in the past. Some people wanting to talk about what happened in the past. Some people very curious about what happened in the past, but sometimes, especially in the older members of the family, they're not wanting to talk about it. And this is, of course, a very common phenomenon in migrant or immigrant families. In events where we've talked about the book, people in the audience have many people have said, "Oh yes, that was in my family too," and in particular, this relationship between Henry, Felice Bauer's son. In the book, he's also called Jáchym. That's his fictional name. And his mother. Well, not really. It didn't remind me of my relationship with my mother, but the relationship of my mother and her brother and her sister with their mother, and some of the difficulties that they had communicating, some of the resentments that people had lasting all the way to the end of my grandmother's life. And I could really feel those things. So I think that Magdalena did a very good job of conveying that in her characterization of the people. And I think that was helped by the fact that she actually met and spoke with and interviewed this Henry, who, when she was working on the book, which is over a period of about 10 years, he was living in the book, it says Rye, New York. I don't remember anymore if that's actually the town he lived in, but he did live in a town north of New York City on the Hudson River. At that time, he was already in what's called a senior living home, so you could call it a retirement home, with his wife, who also appears in the book under a pseudonym and her real name. And she went and spoke with him to try to ask him what he remembered of Felice Bauer as a person, and asked him what she was like. And he was very suspicious of her at first because so many people wanted to talk to him about Kafka. But Magdalena didn't want to talk to him about Kafka, so that made it a little bit easier. But he was still quite reserved. And there's a moment in the book where the narrator, who is Magdalena, says, "I realized I wasn't going to get any more out of him at this point." So it was more that the stress it puts on relationships to go into migration, leaving behind roots, the decisions that people in the family make about what to keep about their past, what to very intentionally forget, what kinds of things fall by the wayside. Yeah, it was those sorts of things that I felt a personal connection to.
And please tell us about your tour with Magdalena, about this Life After Kafka. You're going on a book tour with her.
She started her tour on October 10th in San Diego. That had a second event in San Diego. Then she was in Los Angeles on October 16th. Yesterday, she was at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Now, tomorrow, I'm taking a train up to Boston. And on Monday, we'll be doing an event with Veronika Tokarova, who is actually a Kafka scholar, she's at Harvard. She teaches Czech there, but she and Jonathan Bolton are two people on the faculty at Harvard who both know Czech and teach Czech or Czech literature. So Magdalena and I will be meeting with Veronika's students in the afternoon, and then we'll have a public event Monday evening at 5:30 at Harvard. That's a public event, and Brookline Booksmith is co-sponsoring that. So they've got a sales display of the book. Then on the 23rd, October 23rd, which is Wednesday evening, Magdalena and I will be at the Czech Center, New York in Manhattan with Veronika Tokarova. On the 24th, Magdalena is going to be on a panel with other authors as part of European Literature Night at the Ukrainian Institute of America, also in Manhattan. October 28th, Magdalena and I, will be with Malin Sternstein at the University of Chicago, October 28th at 4:30 p.m. And then on the 29th, we will be at the Goethe Institute in Chicago at 6 p.m. with Irena Chaikova, who's at the University of Chicago. So that's the tour. It's also, the information is at blpress.org. That's the Bellevue Literary Press website.
Yeah, I'll take the link and put it down in the podcast notes.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you again for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's nice to be back on the podcast. It's really incredible what you're doing, this undertaking of speaking to so many translators from so many different languages. I have great admiration for your project, and I hope that it's reaching as many people as possible.
I wish you the very best for the book tour. Thank you, Alex,
Thank
once
you.
again.
Until next time, Anil. Okay.